Ash Mesa smelled like iron and sweat, and something burnt that clung to the back of the throat. The auction platform stood in the middle of the stock pen boards, sun-split and dark with spilled molasses and old blood. Men crowded close hats, pushed back jaws working tobacco. A boy ran past, with a bucket sloshing water that left a clean stripe in the dust. The bell of the scale clanged once. Laughter followed it. Elias Mercer had come for fencing staples and flour. He had the list in his pocket and a knot in his shoulder where the cold settled when the weather turned. He touched the doorknob of Pike's General and felt a thread of cool air lift off the street, a drift that smelled not of horses or whiskey, but of sage after rain. It touched his ear like breath. The words were not English. He knew them anyway. He turned. On the platform, a woman knelt a rope around her wrists, dark hair hanging in wet cords. A guard had tossed a bucket over her and was laughing at the way the water ran off her dress and onto the boards. The auctioneer raised his hands for attention. He wore a vest the color of old grease and boots too fine for his work. "Last piece for the afternoon, gentlemen. Strong back healthy speaks when spoken to," he sang. "Government transfer all legal, who starts at 5. The woman did not look at him. She looked past the roofs to where the mesa broke open and the distance turned blue. Her jaw was set. Her lips moved once, and something like a note threaded the noise, thin as a reed whistle. A drunk near the front waved a bottle. "2, for the winner, she'll keep the bed warm." That got a half-dozen ugly chuckles. Someone slapped a hat brim. Elias knew her people from the bone, even if he did not know her name. The high cheekbones. The way she kept her spine straight, though she knelt on splinters. The paint that no one else could see, not on her skin, but around her as if smoke still clung to her. He also knew that the badge pinned to the auctioneer's lapel did not make the business clean. He had stood under badges before and watched fire. The cool breath of sage moved again. It ran across his scalp, and his shoulder ached the way it did before a storm. Up on the platform, for half a heartbeat, a boy stood behind the woman. 11, maybe. Face marked in ceremonial lines, a small white bone whistle at his throat. He lifted his hand and pointed toward the west, his mouth forming words that did not land. Elias blinked, and the boy was gone. Heat shimmered in his place. 3, someone called. 5, another. 8, Elias said. It came out like a cough. He felt men turn to look at him the way cattle turn when a dog cuts across them. The auctioneer peered into the crowd and smiled with his mouth and not his eyes. "We have 8. Any advance?" Silence spread wide and dry. The drunk tipped his bottle farther and got nothing for it. The guard tightened his hand on the rope. The auctioneer dropped his gavel, the crack of it popping like a shot. Money changed hands. A paper slid across the boards. The rope changed hold. The woman's shoulders flinched at the shift, then steadied. Elias took the rope, but did not pull. He turned his palm up around it and let it slacken. He felt her match his step, not close enough to be led, not far enough to feel the jerk. "Water," Elias said to the auctioneer. His voice came rough from not using it. "Before we go." The man shrugged toward the troughs, amused. "Horses drink free." The crowd parted the way a herd parts for a creek. Elias led the way and stopped beside a long, tin-lined trough. He pulled down the dinged cup that swung from a nail and dipped it knuckles cold. He paused, lifted the cup, took a swallow. Then he handed it to her. She held it and did not drink. Her eyes judged him the way a hawk judges a field. He took another sip and waited. She raised the cup and drank like someone who had learned to hide thirst, small, quick swallows that made her throat work and her eyes stay level. When he refilled, she drank again. On the third, she shook her head. "Here," he said. As she lowered the cup, the threadbare sleeve of her dress slid back from her wrist. At first, it was just a scar, a ragged patch where a rope had rubbed raw and healed wrong. Then the light caught it. The lines were too regular for an accident. A circle with a sunburst etched inside it and a crossed lance laid over the sun, a brand pressed with heated iron. Elias felt the skin under his shirt prickle, where his own scar lay high on his left shoulder, the same sign cut there years ago in fire and orders. He did not reach for it. His breath made the tin cup ring a little as he set it down. The woman looked at him over the lip of the cup. "Deyandasha." She said the syllables careful in her mouth. Her voice was low, not a whisper so much as the shape a whisper makes. Elias did not know the word, not with his tongue. His blood knew it. It set the fine hairs on his wrist up straight. He pulled a knife from his belt. She tightened at the flash of the blade. He held it still where she could see his hands, then cut the rope above her wrists. The line fell, coarse fibers sticking to her skin. She did not run. In the street, no one would have let her get far. That truth lay like a weight between them. He went to his horse. Buck stamped and blew, picking up the edge in Elias's chest. Elias opened a saddlebag and took out a wool blanket that smelled of leather and distance. He offered it to her. "For the ride," he said. She watched him a heartbeat more, then took the blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. She did not hide her neck. The skin there showed clean, and then the brand showed too small and mean and perfect at the hairline. Elias tried not to stare. He failed for a second and then looked away. "Ranch is a few hours," he said. He gestured toward the road that ran along the cottonwood windbreak. "Twin cotton, we will ride double. It is safer than walking in plain sight." She did not ask his permission. She set the blanket, gathered the skirt, slid a foot into the stirrup, and mounted with a quick flex of muscle that said she knew horses better than the men who had tried to break her. Elias put a hand to the saddle horn and swung up behind her. He set his knees careful so his leg would not press her too close. He felt the heat of her back through the wool even in the late light. They moved down the street. The crowd had thinned to a few pairs of eyes, and a couple of men spitting comments aside. Naya Redbird, he would not learn her name until later, kept her head high and her gaze straight on the road out. She did not watch the windows, did not glance at the man with the red neck tying his bootlace in the dust, as if his pride had been stepped on. She watched the pen. The holding pen stood to the right post, dark at the base where urine and mud had made them sick. A chain hung on the gate where it had banged and been dropped. As they passed, the chain twitched. No one touched it. The sound it made was small, a quick metallic click. The wind lifted again, and with it came the clean edge of sage. It cut through the odor of the pens like a knife through fat. "Do you understand me?" Elias asked. He did not know what else to try. He kept his eyes on the road. If she answered, he wanted the shape of it more than the meaning. She looked back once just enough that he saw the curve of her cheekbone and the old scar near the brow white against her skin. She touched her chest with 2 fingers. "Naya," she said. Then she touched her collarbone and the place where the brand lay hidden beneath hair. Redbird. The name sat on the air like the gust had carried it and set it down between them. "Elias," he said. He tapped his own chest. "Mercer." She nodded, then faced forward. The sun sat on the roofline of the livery, like a coin on the edge of a counter. Flies had grown drunk on heat and were slow now. A boy that might have been the auctioneer's runner stood by the pump with his hands in his pockets. He watched them like a dog watches a wagon that has a smell it does not trust. They turned onto the rutted road, the town beginning to loosen its grip. The cottonwoods at the edge clicked their leaves, one tree answering the next. Buck's ears flicked to each small noise, then forward as if the horse understood the word "go" in any language. Elias leaned a little to the left to ease the pull on his shoulder. Behind them, the empty pen breathed. Out of the corner of his eye, Elias caught the shimmer again, heat moving as if a small body had cut the air. At the same instant, a thin, clear note rose from the pen. Not a whistle of steam, not a sparrow. Something else high and sure and human-made. It threaded the distance and touched the bone behind his ear. Buck tossed his head. Naya's hand tightened on the blanket without looking back. They rode on. The town fell behind in layers, noise thinning to the scrape of branches and the rhythm of hooves. The wind leaned into them once more, that sage smell lifting, edged with something cold that did not belong to afternoon. The chain on the pen gate clinked again. No one stood near it. Twin Cotton Ranch sat where the road bent around a windbreak of trees and a shallow creek ran thin under stones. The house was one room and a lean-to neat as a rifled drawer. The corral boards were rubbed smooth by muzzles and weather. A lantern hung from a nail by the door. Elias touched it but did not light it yet. Heat still held the yard like a hand. He slid down first and steadied the mare with a palm to her neck. Naya swung off without help, gathered the blanket tighter, and stood in the doorway, her eyes traveling the walls, the roofline, the corners. He kept his hands open and slow. The pistol at his hip stayed heavy and quiet. Inside the room smelled of ash and old coffee. Books on a shelf had their spines lined even. A photograph in a small frame sat on the table, 2 younger men in uniform shoulders squared to the same angle. The sword over the hearth had not been oiled in a while. Elias stirred the coals and coaxed a flame for light only. He ladled water into a pot without saying what for. When the steam lifted, he set the cup in front of her and stepped back. She watched his face. He took a sip and felt the tin warm his lip. She nodded and drank. The sound of it was careful. He set a bowl of beans on the table and let the spoon clink. She did not eat until he did. "You can have the bed," he said. "I will take the porch." She looked at the bed, then at him. He put a bedroll under his arm and pointed to the bar that slid across the door. He lifted it and set it down so the sound was clear. She moved to the door and put her hand on the bar and felt the weight of it. She slid it into place after he stepped out. He lay with his back to the wall, the stars cut into pieces by the cottonwoods. The creek kept its small voice. Night pulled the heat up into the trees. He listened to the cabin settle to the tiniest scrape that might have been a mouse or might have been a floorboard changed by the temperature. Sleep came slow and light. The wind brought sage again clean and cold. It ran along his forearm and up into the ache in his shoulder. He opened his eyes. The door was a dark rectangle. In that frame for a moment, a boy stood as if drawn there by the smell. His face was painted in thin lines, white on brown, the paint so faint it could have been the memory of paint. A bone whistle hung at his throat, small and polished by touch. He lifted his hand and put a finger to his lips, not to hush Elias, but to mark a border. Then the boy turned his palm toward Elias, a greeting without warmth or anger, and he was gone. The cold that followed had the taste of rock. Elias lay very still until the buzz of night found him again. At first light, the porch boards were damp. The sky took on color in the east, not pink, but the pale of breath on glass. The door opened. Naya stood there with the blanket folded over one arm, her dress smoothed. She looked as if she had not slept at all and not suffered for it. "Coffee," Elias said. He tapped the pot and then his chest. "I make." She tilted her head. Then she held out her hand. She pointed to herself and said nothing, only lifted her eyebrows toward the pot. He stood aside. She moved with assurance, measured the grounds by eye, took water from the barrel out back, and set the pot where the flame licked it best. When it boiled, she lifted it and let the grounds settle, poured, and set a cup down for him first. "You have done this," he said, and smiled because there was nothing else to call that fluency. She did not smile. The corner of her mouth moved the smallest amount. She drank black and hot. They ate heel ends of bread and the last of the beans. Elias checked cinches and bridles his hands, remembering the small mends he should have made last week. He saw how Naya watched the edges of the yard while his head was down. He saw her eyes go to the fence line, to the place where dust rose not from wind but from hooves. "Work," he said. He pointed toward the pasture. "Cattle." She nodded. She picked up a coil of wire and a sack of staples as if they weighed less than they did. They rode along the west fence where the posts leaned a little from the spring runoffs. The ground showed pressed ovals and crescents. Naya swung off and crouched. Her fingertips hovered over the depressions without touching. She held up 2 fingers. She drew a line with one finger that curved toward the lower pasture. "Wolves," Elias said. The print had the long nails and the weight forward. 2 sets, hungry. She pointed to the ridge, then to herself. Then she made a circle with her hand like swinging a rope and let it go. She pointed to him and then to the opposite flank. Her eyes asked a question and made it an instruction. "No gun," he said, testing her idea. She touched her ear and then shook her head once. A noise to startle, not a report to spook everything on 4 legs. She picked up 3 rocks and slipped them into her dress pocket as if they had places there already. He handed her his knife. She took it by the handle and weighed it once, then slid it along her waistband beneath the blanket. They split at the dry wash. Elias left Buck tied in shade and moved low along sage and stone. The air on his hands smelled like iron and plant. Down by the bend, the cattle had bunched heads up ears, twitching. He saw one wolf first, a gray ribbon in brush ribs showing. It was downwind. It had patience and hunger. Somewhere upslope the second watched. Across the way, Naya climbed onto a rock outcrop. She lifted her hands and made a sound that started low and curled up like smoke. It was not a scream. It was a string of syllables that made the hair on Elias's neck stand. Stones clattered down where she kicked them free. The wolf below flinched and shifted weight. Elias stepped from cover enough to be seen. He lifted his rifle to his shoulder but did not sight down it. He shouted one sharp word that meant go to any creature that did not want what came after. The gray turned and broke for thicker brush. The second wolf showed itself on a ledge broader in the chest face, marked by old scars. It dropped its head and bared teeth at Naya. She threw one of her rocks. It hit the nose square. The animal yelped and blinked and slid back into scrub. They waited to be sure. The cattle calmed by inches, tails swishing flies again. Naya came down, breath even, knife-still unseen eyes on the ridge where shadows thickened into trees. "Good," Elias said. The word felt small next to what she had done. She handed him back the knife. She tapped the wire in his hand and then pointed to the fence line bend where cattle pushed. He nodded. They set small tricks along the edges of the pasture. Elias tied tin cups and old can bottoms to twine so that a tug set them clinking. Naya tucked piles of smooth rocks where a hand could reach fast. The wind caught one of the hung tins and made a soft rattle like a warning that got bored and fell asleep again. By the time they rode back, the sun had steepened. Heat came down in sheets. Elias wiped his forearm and left a streak of dust on skin. The house rose out of the glare and looked smaller than it had that morning. They were not alone. 5 horsemen sat in the yard. Their animals were hard-ridden and not tired enough. The men wore trail dust and confidence. The one in front wore it like a coat. His hair had gone to iron at the temples, and his eyes were coin bright. The badge on his chest caught the light. "Afternoon," he said. "Elias Mercer, if memory holds." "Afternoon," Elias said. He kept his voice even. He held the reins in his left hand and let his right rest where it could get to his gun and not look hungry too. "Calder Boone," the man said, "Sheriff of Ash Mesa." He said the town name as if he owned the boards and the air above them. "I have a complaint to resolve. A government property was misallocated yesterday. An Apache woman. Transfer was promised to another buyer before you interfered." Naya sat straight on the mare. Her face was stone. She kept her eyes on the shade line under the eaves as if counting the distance to it. "She was sold at auction," Elias said. "I paid. There are papers." Boone smiled just on one side. "Paper is a habit, not a virtue." He tipped his chin. "Step aside and I will see her return where she belongs." "She belongs nowhere you hold," Elias said. He felt his shoulder tighten and willed the muscle to ease. He did not look at Naya. He could feel the line of her focus like a wire. Boone took a long look at Elias, head to toe, as if weighing his market value. "You served," Boone said. "7th Scouts, Colonel Whitford. You had a reputation." He made the word soft. "Soft is not useful out here." Elias did not answer. The creek ran, and a fly landed on Buck's mane and departed again. The 4 men behind Boone shifted just enough to creak leather. "Careful how you choose Mercer," Boone said. "Law has a long reach if it wants to. Folks in town can be persuaded what is legal if a man with a badge reads it to them right." "Read it to them wrong, and it is still wrong," Elias said. Boone's eyes narrowed the tiniest piece, something like pleasure coming in under his words. "You are outnumbered. You are out of step. You will hand her over." "No," Elias said. Boone watched him another second, then turned his horse with a small tug. He patted the gelding's neck, as if he had accomplished a kindness. "We will speak again," he said, and rode out. Dust climbed up their horses' legs and shook off into the light. One of the men looked back to fix Naya in his sight and smiled without his mouth. They stood listening to the noise of departure until the sound went thin and then away. Elias slid off Buck and led him under the cottonwoods. His hands shook once and then were steady. He poured water into the trough and watched it settle from a churn into a mirror. Naya came to the edge of the shade. She touched her throat where the brand hid. She looked at Elias, and then to his left shoulder, where his shirt lay smooth over a scar he never showed. She stepped in close enough to touch him, and then thought better, and did not. Her fingers hovered over the place. He did not move. Her voice came as if from the floorboards, quiet but certain. "Deyandasha," she said. "The man who killed me will save me." He felt the meaning hit before the grammar did. He wanted to deny the shape of those words and could not. She reached into the fold of the blanket and brought out a small thing on a thong. A whistle carved from bone its surface, worn to satin by years. She held it and looked at him as if asking if the sound of it would break the day. "Keep it," he said. She closed her fist around it and nodded. Her eyes lifted past him. He turned to follow the line of her gaze. Up on the ridge where the road lifted into scrub, a single glint of sun flashed and went out. It came again, the same coin flick, and then nothing. No rider showed himself. The cottonwoods clicked above them. The air changed the slightest, that clean cut of sage slipping under the heat like a second current. The tin on the porch rattled once and was still. They left before the shadows had climbed off the yard. Elias packed quiet and fast. Coffee grounds buried under the cottonwood. Tin cups tied off the fence so the wind would give warning if anyone came along the road. Naya moved with him, light on her feet, blanket slung like a shawl. She did not ask, and he did not explain. Buck tossed his head once and settled. They took the wash that ran north past basalt outcrops, horses picking careful steps in loose rock. Heat lay lower there, caught between walls. Dragonflies stitched invisible lines above the trickle of water. When the wash widened, Naya turned right into a narrow cut that looked like nothing but shadow until they were in it. The air changed. It cooled and smelled of damp stone. The light went soft and green. The cave mouth sat behind a screen of scrub cedar. Elias would have missed it at a trot. Inside, the ground gave under his boots with the softness of old dust. A spring whispered in the back. He held the lantern low and kept the flame small. Shapes on the ceiling were not bats, just soot from old fires that had licked a story across the rock. Naya set her blanket down and knelt. From a small pouch at her throat, she took a pinch of yellow powder and tipped it into her palm. She blew it gently until the dust drifted in a circle and sank to the floor. Her lips moved, sound barely there, more breath than voice. The spring sound answered in a way that felt like language. Elias stood at the edge of the circle. The lantern flame thinned. Cold touched the back of his neck as if a thread had been drawn out of him. Then the cave was not empty. Figures stood where there had been air. Shapes the eye could not hold in one place. A woman with a braid to her waist. A child whose feet did not quite touch the ground. A man with a face cut by old lines, his hair tied back, a scar along one cheek. Their bodies were like glass with smoke inside. None of them looked at the lantern. All of them looked at Naya and then at Elias. The man raised his hand to Elias and turned his palm out. The gesture felt like contact. Elias did not reach. He did not flinch. Something in him recognized the weight of that distance and that greeting. The smell of sage was under stone, now green and clean. Naya's voice gathered strength and fell again, a tide on bare rock. The child lifted a bone whistle to his mouth. The silver light that was not from the lantern caught on its smooth curve. Elias did not hear a note. He felt one lay against his ribs. Naya finished, and the shapes relaxed around the edges. The man tipped his chin once in the old soldier's way. The spring ran on like nothing had changed. Naya opened her eyes, and the cave went back to only rock and water and two people sharing breath. They reached the rim above the mission at dusk. San Miguel's walls were white in the last light and showed every thumbprint the plasterers had left. A bell swung in a small arch and sent a lazy sound across the fields. Cottonwood trees along the irrigation ditch wore a dust of light. Figures moved in the yard between chapel and dormitory. A line of boys crossed to the refectory shirts, white hair cut blunt. Naya watched until her breath settled. Then she slipped behind a screen of brush and came back with her dress wrapped around her like a memory. The mended seams lay straight, the beadwork on the neckline dulled but true. She set her hand to her chest and breathed out once. Elias took the rifle across his knees and kept his body low under the lip of rock. When the dinner bell stopped and the yard began to empty, Naya moved. She slid along the back of the stone wall where the moon had not yet found purchase. One hand on the top course, the other steadying her weight on the inside, she went over in a smooth climb and dropped to the far side without sound. Elias watched her shadow go down the long edge of the dormitory. He counted slowly. He watched the door. No one came out. The lamp in the hallway glowed like a yoke. He eased the rifle around and fired toward the dry hills far beyond the orchards. The shot cracked the air and set the bell rope twitching. Men turned and ran to the sound. Voices rose and broke. Elias lifted the rifle again, fired once more into open, and waited. Inside the dormitory, the hall smelled of soap and straw. Naya moved past hanging shirts and small boots lined under cots. The boy she had watched from the ridge sat on his bed with his hands folded. He looked older in stillness. The planes of his face matched to hers, the eyes darker. He had his shoes off. He did not startle when she reached the doorway. He looked up as if he had been watching the square of darkness for someone to step into it. She said his name quiet. The word filled the room the way water fills a cup. He stood. For one flash, he was the child in her memory, and then he was the young man in front of her. His mouth pulled tight at one side, and his hands made fists and opened again. He wore a small thing on a thong around his neck, a bone whistle rubbed to satin. He touched it the way a man checks that a weapon is where it belongs. Naya did not move. She held his face with her eyes. He spoke her name like he was testing the edge of a knife for sharpness. Then he came to her, and in 2 steps he had his hands on her shoulders, and she had her hands in his hair. They stood like that until the hallway filled with footsteps. "Back door," he whispered. "The yard by the root cellar." His English carried the rhythm of lessons and the cadence of home under it. They reached the corner and slid through a door held by a wedge of wood. The night opened in front of them, with the scent of damp earth and onions. The root cellar smelled like cool dirt and promise. Voices moved somewhere else, tracing the path of the rifle shots. Elias fired again once high and far, and they ran bent at the waist along the orchard's low stone wall. Talon moved sure on his feet, not the gait of a boy taught in a yard, but the memory of moving through brush where anything that snaps can tell the world you are there. He took Naya's hand as if to steady her, and she let him believe it. Elias joined them at the juniper stand where the path left the garden and went to the wash. He lowered the rifle and reached out. Naya passed Talon's hand to him, and for a moment all three of them were connected with palms and fingers, and that thin line of heat where skin meets skin. Then they were moving again, the underbrush giving up its twigs to their legs. Behind them the bell took up its voice in long pulls. A lantern flicked and bobbed along the wall. Another answered from the chapel steps. Men called and did not find what they were calling for. The wash welcomed them like a door that only looks closed. Elias set a hand to Buck's neck and felt the horse's warm trust and fear. He boosted Naya to the saddle and Talon up behind her. The mare shifted and steadied. Elias ran alongside to the place where the wash deepened and the bank was soft and gave up clear print to anything that followed. He stepped onto a sandbar and lifted a fallen branch to brush at the marks. Talon slid from the saddle and joined him without a word. The boy's hands moved fast, erasing where hooves had turned. They did not stop until the cave's shadow drew around them again. Naya led the horses in and looped the reins without tying them. The animals stood with heads low and ears flicking. Elias set the lantern low and did not feed it much. Talon leaned against the rock and pulled air into himself, like he had nearly forgotten how to use his lungs for anything but praying. He looked at the woman who was his sister and at the man he had seen before, only in a flash when a different world had been on fire. He touched the whistle with 2 fingers. "I remember your face," he said to Elias. "Smoke everywhere, a horse in my hands and a voice saying north." Elias nodded. Words seemed too heavy for the cave. Naya opened the pouch at her throat again and took the yellow dust into her palm. She added a scrap of dried herb that broke under her fingers like paper. She motioned them to sit. Elias set his back to the wall and let his shoulder find a place where it could forget itself for a minute. Talon sat across from him and folded his legs, knees knocking lightly in a rhythm that stopped when Naya put her hand on his shin. She drew a circle with the powder and the herb, a thin thread on the floor of the cave. She sang. The sound rose and fell and made promises to the rock. Talon joined on a phrase he should not have known. His voice cracked and held. The circle did not look like much. It felt like shelter. The cave lifted its breathing. The spring slowed and then ran clear. Shapes stood just out of the lantern's light, then stepped into it because light and shadow did not matter to them. The child stood near Talon and wore his face from 5 years ago. His hair fell into his eyes. Paint lay on his cheeks so faint you could have convinced yourself it was light playing at being paint. He lifted his bone whistle and moved it across his lips, but did not make sound. The older warrior came to stand behind Elias. He put his hand out once more, palm forward, and when Elias lifted his own hand without knowing why their palms met at a space where air had more weight than air usually does. Talon's breath went uneven, his eyes fixed on the child. The child lifted his hand and put it palm to Talon's chest, right over the steady drum of his heart. There was a humming then, too low to be heard enough to be felt in the bones of the floor. Talon's shoulders went stiff, then released. The child leaned in and pressed his forehead to Talon's. The lantern flared without brightening. The smell of sage climbed and settled. The child stepped forward again, and the boundary that separated him from Talon softened until it was nothing. He was no longer apart. Talon sat very still. His mouth opened and closed once with no sound. Then he drew a single full breath and his face changed the way a face changes when someone recognizes a road they had been walking in the dark. Naya's voice slowed and went silent. The cave held its quiet. Elias felt his shoulder loosen under its scar, and the ache slide back like a tide going out. He did not move. Talon lifted the whistle and looked at it. He brought it to his mouth and blew one gentle note. The sound was clear and small and did not ask for help. It went out into the cave and came back changed by stone. Outside, a lantern bobbed once along the ridge above the wash and stopped. Another answered from farther down, a second small star in the brush. The tin Elias had tied to the fence line miles away knocked together and fell still in his mind. The wind carried Sage into the mouth of the cave and took a long time to leave. They reached Fort Resolute at noon by a line of hills that kept them below the horizon. The stockade sat square on the flats, four corners capped with blockhouses, flags, lifting and falling in a lazy wind. A small creek slid past the western wall and fed cottonwoods that had learned to drink little. Men crossed the yard with the slow confidence of a place that did not expect visitors. Elias glassed the ground between them and the creek. He saw where someone had cut a path under the bank and braced it with old timbers. Willows tried to hide the scar and failed. Naya crouched and touched a fresh tool mark on a beam. Talon found the mouth behind a mat of roots, a black square big enough for a man on hands and knees. Inside smelled like earth and cold wood. The lantern threw a gentle coin of light. Roots poked through the ceiling and drew dark lines across the packed clay. Mice had left tracks that vanished where the floor turned to stone steps. The trapdoor at the top stuck against something heavy. Elias pressed until the weight slid. He lifted the door and peered into a storeroom where sacks of flour leaned in rows and a cracked barrel bled the smell of sour mash. They climbed through and slid the door shut, then pulled an empty crate over it. The hall outside was quiet except for the scrape of a chair and someone whistling a hymn off the right note. The yard lay in white sun. Most of the men were not in it. The mess bell had rung not long ago. The commander's office was across the way. Elias counted to 3 and ran. The others moved with him low along the shadow of the wall. He opened the door with a pick he had not used in years. The lock gave up. They went in and barred it. The room was clean and disciplined. A desk with a blotter and an army pen set. Campaign maps on the wall pinned with red string and small flags. Filing cabinets stood along the back like a line of men at attention. The smell of ink lay under the dust. Elias worked the drawers with steady hands. He knew the order by habit, action reports by date, supply logs by company, casualty rolls in their own terrible neatness. Talon searched 2 eyes running across headings he had been taught to prize reading as if he were stealing it back for himself. Naya moved along the cabinets and pulled folders with a precision that had nothing to do with reading and everything to do with seeing what men try to hide. Talon found it, a buff folder with a red grease pencil mark across the tab, Operation Cinder Sky. He opened it, and the first page lay clean and official. A preemptive action, hostiles neutralized. Elias flipped to the back and found a second set of pages clipped under the first. Handwritten orders not filed in the same calm hand. The script leaned downhill and did not care for margins. Leave no survivors. Burn all holdings. Punitive. Sheriff Calderboone signed the bottom with his old title captain. Naya stood beside Elias. Her breath did not change. Her jaw tightened once. Elias folded the pages and slid them under his shirt. The paper was cool on his skin and felt heavier than it should have. Boots sounded on the boardwalk outside. Voices ran together, then separated into orders. Elias looked at the window. It was small and set high. The bar across the door would not hold a minute under a man with a ram. The first blow hit like a tree shoved against the wall. The bar jumped in its brackets. Elias moved to the window, climbed a chair, and pushed the sash up enough to get air and a way out. He looked down into a narrow strip of yard that led toward the stables. He dropped to the floor. Out, he said. Naya slid onto the chair and then through the window and down. Talon followed in a thin line. Elias waited for the next blow. He saw the bar bend and felt the grain of the door give. He climbed, swung his legs through, and dropped after them. They ran along the wall, keeping low. The stables were close. A shout turned their way. The sharp crack of a rifle cut the air. Splinters took a bite from the water trough where Elias threw himself. Naya slid in opposite him, breathing slow. Talon crouched between them, eyes on the open ground. They were not going to make it to the horses. Bodies moved at the far end of the yard, more rifles, more voices. Elias shifted and lifted to draw fire. He saw a second group coming through the gate line with dust at their backs and a badge flashing like a coin. A wagon rolled behind them, with people from town on it. Martha Pike from the store sat on the bench beside a thin man with a doctor's bag. A rider with a Federal star turned his horse straight toward the commotion. A new voice cut through and held everything. The tone was not loud. It carried anyway. Stand down. The rifles wavered. Colonel Silas Whitford walked into the yard with his hat tucked under his arm. He looked at the barred office door and then at Elias by the trough, at Naya and at Talon. He looked at the men with guns who had been ready to shoot and at the riders coming fast, the badge on the lead horse bright. Marshal Ruth Delaney slid from the saddle before the horse had stopped. She held her papers like a blade. The wind took one corner and laid it back. She tucked it down with a finger. Martha Pike climbed from the wagon and planted her boots. Dr. Ezra Cole stood close enough to touch the marshal's sleeve and did not. "Colonel A," the marshal said, "I have authority to examine records of engagements with native settlements in this district." Whitford's jaw moved. He nodded to a sergeant. "Lower your rifles." The yard eased a little, the way a body does when a cramp lets go. Elias stood with his hands open. He took the papers from under his shirt and offered them to Naya. She kept them. She did not mean to surrender them to anyone without seeing where they landed. Whitford held out a hand. Naya stepped forward and set the folded packet in his palm. He read. The sun made a small square of light crawl across the page as his eyes moved. The muscles at the corners of his mouth flexed. He turned to the marshal and passed the pages without speaking. Delaney read faster. She looked up when she reached the second page. She looked at Naya. She looked at Talon. She looked at Elias. She nodded once. "Hear me," Whitford said. The men in the yard quieted. "No one touches these three without my order. The law will look at this." Dust rose again at the gate like a curtain lifted fast. Sheriff Calderboone came in at a hard trot with men to either side. His face had set into something that did not need words. He saw the marshal. He saw the colonel. He saw Naya and Talon and Elias. He saw the papers in Delaney's hand. "Those go back to my office," Boone said. He meant the town, not the fort. They were taken without authority. These are fugitives. The woman is stolen property. "She is not," Whitford said. "This is my post. The marshal has jurisdiction. You will wait outside the gate." Boone smiled without smiling. "I will do no such thing." He did not draw. He did not need to. His men fanned not much, just enough to say how many shots it would take to change the situation. Whitford lifted his voice, and the fort gates closed behind Boone with a wooden finality. The sheriff backed his horse and rode out slow, as if the pull of leaving cost him effort. His men followed. No one in the yard moved until the dust laid itself back down. Light bled from the day into a thin gold. Elias stood with his shoulder pressed to the stable post and felt the grain under his skin. Martha Pike came to him and put her hand on his forearm just above the wrist and squeezed. She did not speak. Dr. Cole looked at Naya with a physician's eyes and then at Talon with something like surprise. He had not expected to see this boy anywhere but a mission classroom. Shots popped at the far side of the fort as the gates stayed barred and men took positions at the walls. Boone had not gone far. His men settled in the brush and gathered brush of their own. Elias smelled oil and pitch when the wind turned. The light sank. Whitford's hand found Elias's shoulder and guided him into a small office off the yard. Delaney followed with Naya and Talon and Martha and Dr. Cole. The colonel poured whiskey into tin cups with the speed of a man who has done this after every hard thing in his life. Naya did not take one. Talon did not either. Delaney did and did not drink. The whiskey scented the air and stung the cut on Elias's knuckle when he lifted his cup and set it down again. The crackle came before the glow. Someone outside shouted, and then the shout doubled and ran. Fire licked along brush piled against the outer wall. Shots rang higher and closer. Whitford moved with a calm born of years. Delaney pulled the packet of papers into the inside pocket of her coat and buttoned it. Elias saw the motion and felt relief like cool water. No one discussed leaving. They moved to a side corridor that smelled of old canvas and oil. A narrow door opened on the west wall. The night air lifted in. The ground outside the postern was hard and generous with small stones that would not hold print. Elias went out first. The cottonwoods along the creek reached toward the corner of the fort and shook their leaves. Naya stepped into the shadow with Talon right behind her. Delaney came last, head-bent, hand on her pocket. The first shot came from the right, not from the line of Boone's men at the gate, but from the brush above the creek, where a single horse stood with its reins looped around a snag. Boone stepped out of the dark rifle at his shoulder, eyes bright as if light rose from inside him. "I knew you would try this door," he said. His voice carried the pleasure of being right. "That is the trouble with scouts. You all share the same tricks." Delaney dropped and drew. Boone fired first. The sound struck Elias faster than the pain. It felt like a hammer through a plank, and then the plank gave, and there was nothing to hold. He went to one knee and then the other. He saw the muzzle flash hang in the air a fraction of a blink. He heard Naya make a sound he had not heard from her, yet low and fierce, and made of breath torn on stone. Delaney's shot caught Boone in the side. He rocked and kept his feet. He lifted the rifle again, stubborn as his own reputation. Naya was already moving. She came in low, the knife Elias had given her a dark line under the stars. She took Boone's wrist and turned it with a snap. The rifle fell to the ground and thumped Benedictine on the stones. Boone hit her with his free hand. It drove the air out of her. She did not let go. Talon rose behind her and took Boone around the shoulders. For a heartbeat, the three of them were one knot of muscle and bone trying to decide which way weight falls. Delaney fired again. Boone jerked his legs, went uncertain, and then he went down hard and stayed. The night went wider and quieter around the sound of Elias pulling breath like a man learning a new task. He lay on his back with the stars small and far and the cottonwood leaves shaking a pattern across his vision. The pain had the feel of a tide refusing to ebb. Heat poured out of him into the ground. Naya knelt at his side and pressed both hands to his chest. Her palms were sure. Her face was set. She looked at his eyes and did not look away. Delaney crouched and tore fabric and tried to slow blood with a scarf. She looked at Naya and something passed between them that did not need words. Delaney moved back one pace. Naya reached for the little pouch at her throat and took out a powder that caught light like sand from the bottom of a river. She blew it across Elias's face, and the cold of it licked along his cheekbones and down into his throat. She sang with no concern for who might hear. The sound made the night different. The cottonwoods answered, and the only voiced trees have a silver rustle and a stillness between. Elias felt the ground open under him and hold. The smell of sage rose. The boy with paint stood at his shoulder and did not look like memory now. He looked like a person you could touch. The older warrior stood behind the boy and lifted his hand. Elias put his palm to that offered hand. He had learned not to be surprised when his skin met what the eye called air. Naya's voice winded into the dark and pulled something back. Elias followed it because he trusted the voice. He went where it told him. Heat left. Cold came and went. He saw light without a source. He saw faces that were not his and belonged to him anyway. Delaney pressed cloth and kept her pistol in the other hand. Talon stood over Boone and watched the man who had given the order that burned his world. Boone's eyes saw nothing now. The curve of his mouth had settled into a shape that did not carry a thought. The brush by the wall burned and then did not. Men shouted on the far side where the fort made its stand. Horses blew through their noses. Naya leaned closer until Elias could see the hairs on her cheek catch the starlight. He felt the cord he had been holding slacken. He took air into a body that had wanted to leave. It hurt. He did it again. Naya's song dropped and steadied. She set her palm over the wound and heat ran from her hand into him, not soft, not kind, simply an exchange. When he opened his eyes fully, the stars were where they had been, and the cottonwoods made their same patient music. Delaney looked at him and then at Naya and then back to the wall. She rose with the papers quiet under her coat. Talon put his hand to Elias's shoulder, a careful weight that asked permission. Elias turned his head a fraction and met his gaze. The wind changed. It brought the clean edge of sage and the faint sour of powder. The creek ran on a thin voice in the dark. The fort held. The night smelled like ash and water. Elias woke to a roof of woven willow, turning the light into soft river patterns. Smoke traced a thin line through the top vent. The world smelled like sage and damp earth, and something bitter ground fine. His chest hurt when he breathed. He breathed again. Naya sat on a mat with a stone mortar between her knees. She worked herbs to paste slow and sure. Her hair was braided tight, a few stray strands catching the light. When she saw his eyes open, her face loosened. "You came back," she said. He tried to sit. Pain pressed him down with a polite hand. Naya came close and set a palm to his sternum. Her touch was warm. She lifted a cup and held it so he could drink. The liquid tasted of mint and smoke and something metallic that left the tongue clean. "Boone," he said. "Dead," she said. "Marshall has the papers. Colonel holds the fort. The men outside scattered when the wall did not open for them." He closed his eyes and saw the cottonwoods by the postern gate. He saw the water lay itself over stones and pretend the world had not changed. The door flap moved, and an old woman stepped in without announcing. She was small and upright, her hair white and braided with leather and copper beads. The lines in her face were cut clear like the marks left by water that returns to the same channel each spring. "Kiona," Naya said. The old woman studied Elias as if his bones were written pages. She put 2 fingers on his pulse and watched his throat move when he swallowed. Her gaze shifted to the bandage and back to his eyes. "You are hard to keep," she said, not unkind. "But you stayed." "Thank you for shelter," Elias said. She tipped her chin as if the words weighed right. She spoke to Naya in their language, then to Elias again. You walk with spirits and with people. Do not forget both doors. She left as quiet as she had come. Naya tied off the bandage with a neat knot and leaned back on her heels. Where are we? He asked. Hidden Valley, she said. Our people and others who needed a place. She helped him sit with care and drew the door flap aside. The light outside made the shadows inside gentle. He saw low domes of willow and hide mixed with plank houses, the shapes sitting easy on the land. Smoke rose from a dozen fires, each a different taste. Corn and chile, coffee, meat roasting slow. Children ran in a pack with a dog that looked like it had decided to be theirs. A woman with a Mexican shawl hauled water from a spring. Two men split juniper rounds with a rhythm that made a decent song. Farther off, someone sang in a language he did not know. It fit. Talon came back near sundown with 3 rabbits slung from a braided cord. Dust powdered his cuffs. He stopped in the doorway and took in the scene with a quick sweep of the eyes. He grinned at Naya and then looked at Elias and let the grin soften. You look better, he said. Thanks to your sister, Elias said. Talon touched the bone whistle at his throat like a man checks a habit. He gave a short note, nothing urgent. A cluster of smaller children appeared from behind a woodpile as if the sound had lifted them. Talon led them with a hush in his voice to the edge of the clearing where he set up 2 sticks in a string game. They giggled and argued and sorted themselves without adults pushing them into shape. The whistle went quiet against his chest. It looked less like a warning, more like a name. A rider from the south arrived the next day with dust in his beard and a paper in his coat. He asked for Kiona and the marshal. Delaney stepped out of a plank house with her sleeves rolled and spoke to him in low words. She opened the paper and read, lips moving. She went still for a breath and then looked toward Naya and Talon and Elias. She did not raise her voice. She came to them on foot. She handed Kiona the notice first, then Naya, then Elias. The seal at the top shone wax red. The words below set down that an inquiry had begun, that certain officers were called to answer for unauthorized actions, that statements would be taken under oath. It named Operation Cinder Sky and did not dress the phrase with softer cloth. It did not return anything burned. It put names in ink. Martha Pike and Dr. Ezra Cole came a week later with supplies and the kind of quiet that sits between people who have made a choice. Martha brought flour and needles wrapped in cloth. Dr. Cole brought a box of books and a laugh that had been hungry for use. They set their bundles down by Kiona's fire and took off their hats. No speeches. Hands found hands. The valley marked the change with a gathering. Not a ceremony given to visitors, not a performance. A night where each family brought what they had and what they could make into a meal, and someone tied a drumhead tighter, and someone shook dried pods until they were rattle and rhythm. The fire threw light along faces that had learned to survive together. A woman with beads in her hair sang low and slow a song with a spine in it. Men answered with a line that felt like footpaths worn smooth. Elias sat on a rolled blanket back strong for the first time since the bullet and felt the heat of the fire on the tops of his hands. Naya leaned into his shoulder, as if that place had been shaped for her. Talon sat with his knees up and his elbows on them, watching others and being watched, part of something and not yet used to it. Kiona stood and lifted a hand. Talk settled by small degrees. She spoke plain, her voice only as loud as needed to carry. She named the people who had come in that spring and the ones gone since winter. She thanked the creek for staying true and the wind for bringing rain this time. She did not ask for anything. She set her hand on Naya's head for a heartbeat, and then on Talon's, and then on Elias's shoulder, the same shoulder that held the old brand and the new scar. When the noise picked up again, when laughter cut open a new path and followed it, Naya turned to Elias. Her eyes were clear. She tipped her head toward the grove where willow grew thick and green by the bend in the stream. Come, she said. They went down to the cut bank with a hatchet and a coil of rawhide. The willow gave with a wet crack. They stripped leaves until their hands smelled green to the wrists. By the time the moon lifted, a circle of poles stood planted, their tops bent, and tied a rib cage without skin. Naya moved inside the circle and laid her palm to each joint as if greeting a friend. Elias tied knots until his fingers remembered the way his father had taught him to dock a line and the way a scout ties a shelter that will not come down in wind. Talon wandered over with his hands in his pockets and leaned on one of the uprights. He watched without commentary. At the last tie, he stepped forward and held the lash so Elias could pull it clean. They stepped back together and looked at the shape they had made. It already held a kind of heat. Do you want it here? Elias asked. Yes, Naya said. She tested the doorway with her shoulder and gave him a look that landed soft and steady. Here. They brought armfuls of brush and hide and canvas patched with feed sacks. The skin went over bones and the structure settled into itself. The entrance faced the cottonwoods. Inside, the ground was bare and ready for mats. Outside, the last red bled off the rock and the air cooled to something a person can breathe close. Elias stood a small distance back and touched his shoulder without thinking. The old ache was quiet. The scar under his shirt felt like a line drawn over a chapter that had been read and not forgotten. Naya came to him and set her fingers over his hand. She did not move them. They stood that way for a moment, present to the weight of skin and the simple fact of standing. Across the clearing, Talon lifted the whistle and gave one low note a call that said, "Come, not hurry." Children drifted toward him like leaves finding a curve in the stream. He laughed when they jostled him, a laugh with the sound of someone who had found the right distance between grief and the next thing. A breeze came up the valley. It carried sage and damp, and the faint cold taste of a cold fire stirred. It moved through the willow leaves and set a shimmer across the new house. Kiona watched from her doorway and nodded once. Marshall Delaney sat on a stump hat in her lap, eyes on the dark line of Hill's papers tucked safe under her coat. Martha passed a loaf to an old man with a scar through his eyebrow. Dr. Cole told a story to a pair of boys who leaned in hard to catch the parts where his hands drew maps in air. Naya stepped into the doorway of the wiki-up and looked back at Elias. He joined her. Inside smelled like willow and hide and the cut edge of rope. There was room for 2 mats and a small fire where smoke would find the vent. He could hear the creak from here, and the dry talk of cottonwood leaves, and the quiet note of Talon's whistle blending with it. The sound held. The light went softer. The wind laid a cool hand on their faces and left. The house breathed once and learned its shape. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.